Teasing me over there. But I want to welcome everybody to Louie's and Icebox Days number 40. It's sure gone by fast. This is our History on Tap series. We're in our third year of it. But I'm Mike Williams, and I have Ashley Vine on my left and Vern Johnson. But like I do for every one of the shows, a reminder, this is a discussion. I mean, it's not a lecture. Nobody likes to be lectured. The bar remains open during the period here, so give Looney's the business. And we have t-shirts, sweatshirts, and books for sale over here. And we do have a donation box, and anything is really appreciated. So many of our expenses here are not reimbursed. And we are filming again, so please try not to spend too much time right out front. But our subject today is Legends of the Lake, and that includes places, people, events, but mostly little known and maybe even forgotten facts of Rainy Lake. But I'm going to start off with a question for all of you. How many of you have been to Rainy Lake City or know where it is and have a little show? Many, many, many. How about the city of Island View? I mean, that's where Shay Shay is, Island View, Thunderbird, basically everybody. But how about Island City? How many of you have ever been to Island City? I don't see any hands whatsoever, but I would imagine that virtually all of you have. I'm going to read a little article here from the newspaper from Rainy Lake City, probably 1895, 96. Island City, a new town just platted by George D. Stinson, located in the heart of the gold mines of Rainy Lake. Island City is beautifully situated on level ground and destined to be the most popular summer resorts in the Golden Northwest. It fronts on the only sand beach to be found on Rainy Lake, making this the finest location on the lake for bathing and boating. They go on a little bit more, but I'll finish with. The place now has a hotel, boarding house, store, and 7 other buildings. Lots are being offered for a short time for only $75 for corners and $50 for insides. Does anybody have a clue as to where that is?
Sandpoint?
Sandpoint Island. Imagine that. But it really never happened. And Island City left with the gold rush, probably around 1901. But later on, a man by the name of William P. Hapgood and his companion Ernest Oberholzer, they had a sheep goat raising operation on Deer Island, which is now Camp Cooch. They purchased Sandpoint Island during World War I for the purpose of raising sheep and goats. By 1922, their project folded and Oberholzer gained possession of the island. But Ober never did develop the island. He kept it open for public picnicking, camping, swimming. And after more than 50 years, in 1975, he sold it back to the Canadian government. But they honored Ober's wishes in that it remained open to the public, and to this day now it's known as Sandpoint Island Provincial Park. Interesting little known fact of Rainy Lake.
Yeah.
Ashley?
So what I'm going to share with you today is about some of the rock art that you can find on Rainy Lake. And so these are native pictographs. They are made with red ochre. And red ochre is a really interesting substance because it lasts forever. I mean, thousands of years, and you can still see it. Whereas like modern paint today, if you were to go out and paint a rock, which please don't do that. But if you were to do that, it would fade over time, and eventually you would not be able to tell what you have drawn. Whereas with these native pieces of art, you can still see what they are. There are thousands of pictographs in the borderland and across the Shield region. And we don't know who the artists are, although within the Shield region, it's commonly accepted among scholars that they were created by Algonquin-speaking people. And for those people, they believe that wherever these pieces of art are extremely sacred, and that's where very powerful Manitous were residing. And when they were making this art, it was basically depicting their success with receiving medicine. And when I talk about medicine, I'm talking about spiritual medicine that they're gaining from the Manitous. Much of the artwork depicts animals, it depicts people, it depicts these spiritual beings. And if you ever come across it, obviously look with your eyes, not your hands, don't touch it, please don't deface it. A lot of the artwork has been defaced, which is very sad. And one of the most spectacular pieces that has been painted on the rocks is a being known as Mishipishu. And Mishipishu was the Great Lynx, or the underwater wildcat. And Mishipishu was responsible for controlling the weather and the activity on the lake. So the natives would basically smoke a pipe and speak to Mishipishu and say, like, hey, we're gonna go on a voyage in our canoe. Maybe, like, let us have safe passage. Don't wreck us, because we want to live. And, you know, hopefully they would have a good, safe passage. And Mishipishu is known as the chief Manitou. When he's depicted as a wildcat. He'll have a scaled body, and he'll have horns on his head, which emit a lot of powerful medicine. And so, yeah, he's really just the most incredible piece to see. We have a picture of him on our exhibit, so if you'd like to see what Mishipishu looks like, you can check him out there.
I'm going to continue a little bit on the art topic and talk about the statue of Alma Dahlberg that was at the Dahlberg estate. And I can remember the night of August 11th, 1936, the sky was bright with a fire that was burning at Dahlberg's Island. We were living at Camp Kuchting, and then we went over to fight the fire at the council. Went over and helped out the fire on Jackfish Island. But the guest house burned to the ground. The next day, my father was hired to become the new caretaker because they lost some confidence in the existing caretaker, strangely. One of the new things that to be discovered by a 6-year-old boy, one thing stands out today. It was a life-size bronze statue of the Dahlberg's teenage daughter, Alma Lee, which had been made at the Isle of Capri. And in one hand it held a dagger, in the other it bore a lion's head. This was exciting stuff for a young boy. The fact that she was nude, not so much. As the years went by, the interest in the dagger and its prey diminished as the interest in the girls increased. We left the Red Crest in 1945, and during the following years of neglect, the vandals came in full force and demolished everything of beauty remaining, including the lovely statue, which I understand was destroyed by sledgehammer and the pieces pitched off the cliff into the Rainy Lake. If anyone here has a broken piece of green cast bronze and doesn't know where it came from, give me a shout. I might be able to identify it.
Thanks, Vern. I have another question for the audience. Have any of you ever been to Camp Marsden on Rainy Lake? Oh, I see 2 former park employees or current park employees. It's located some 20 miles from east of Island View on the Capitolina Peninsula in Browns Bay. And all that remains today of that camp is just one single red-roofed cabin But if you land on the shore, there's numerous rock foundations and chimneys. It does have a very interesting history. In 1921, Professor Dodds from Iowa State University in Ames, Iowa, was looking for a site for a summer educational camp for engineers. 1923, he was able to obtain the Browns Bay location, and the first classes were held that same year. He named it Camp Marsden after Anson Marsden, who was the first dean of engineering at Iowa State. The students lived in tents to begin with, but by 1930 or so, were building a new cabin each year. They learned, the purpose of them there was to learn wilderness surveying techniques under primitive conditions with very few distractions. Each year, 35 men, no women, would arrive in Rainier, and then John Erickson, right here at the dock, would transport them to the Browns Bay site. And they would stay there for 6 weeks. But by 1938, the new dean of engineering at Iowa State thought that the camp was too remote and too expensive, so the use of it was discontinued. And the cabins that were there were eventually leased by the owner of the property, which was the M&O Paper Company, to individuals, some from International Falls. And those individuals continued to use the cabins until the property was purchased by Waziers National Park. The park allowed the use of the cabins for 10 years. And after that time, the buildings were dismantled and burned, all except the one that remains. But there's a very, very interesting video on YouTube, Iowa State University Camp Marsden. It's an 8.5 minute, black and white, no sound, but really interesting. But if you do ever plan to visit this site, and I suggest it, this rocky shoreline all the way around except behind, very close, exposed to the south, is a nice little sand beach that's right there on the site, so you can dock your boat safely. But I recommend stopping there. Oh, I'll continue on. But the Shelland Island, I find this interesting. I've always wondered how different islands got their names, but in the mid-1990s, I was volunteering at the Northwest Sports Show in Minneapolis for the Chamber, and an elderly gentleman stopped by. He saw the banner behind me saying Rainy Lake, and he said, there's an island on Rainy Lake named after my father. Of course, I was interested. And he said Shelland Island. His dad was part of the original map-making crew in the early part of the 20th century, and he and his companions camped on a nice level sand beach where the Anderson cabin, was recently removed, but they stayed there the whole summer. And the island did not have a name, so he named it after himself. Shelland Island. So when I'm traveling down the lake, guiding, and I get a lot of questions from tourists, and one of them that I seem like I get every day is how deep is Rainy Lake? And I reply that the deepest spot, at least that I know, is 164 feet, really close to Windmill Rock, which is some 20-25 miles from Island View. But I always mention that I'm not really that concerned with the deep spots in Rainy Lake, it's the shallow spots. But I also mentioned to him that I don't know where all the shallow spots are, but I do know where they are not. But then they also asked how big is Rainy Lake, and I replied 360 square miles, which is a big lake. And then they asked me how many islands, and to tell you the truth, I really don't know. I've heard 1,000, I've heard 2,200. But if anybody's got more accurate, I'd like to know that.
Mike,
Yes.
Joe Long did a deep study on that on the number of islands, and I remember him publishing it in a journal, but I don't remember what the number was. Come on!
Same as me. All I know is there's a lot of them, but what do they call an island? Does it have to be like an acre or a tenth of an acre? Or?
But he designated in that article how many or what constitutes an island.
I do know that very few of them are named.
But there were lots.
Well, speaking of names, does anybody here know how Kettle Falls got its name? Well, I'm going to do my best. But when people ask about that, I tell them what I've read about how it got its name, and that there's a natural formed kettle in the rock, and also below the fall of the rapids, it's a big wide open area, the shape of a kettle or a cauldron, and the water is swirling around it, and it always looks like it's boiling. Kettle Falls. But the problem with that is the Kettle Falls that we know, which is the hotel and the dam that's right next to it, looks nothing like that whatsoever. What they're referring to, Kettle Falls, is 3/8 of a mile south at what we call the Canadian Dam or the Squirrel Falls. So it's my opinion, maybe mine alone, that was Kettle Falls. And somehow that whole area was named Kettle Falls, but now we all refer to Kettle Falls as the hotel and the dam next to it. But if you ever get an opportunity to boat on around the corner, whether you're on the Namakan side or the Rainy Lake side of Kettle Falls, is stop in there. It's incredibly scenic and a very, very historic site. At one time had an incredibly large Indian village there, and as kids, Chuck and I used to find artifacts on the shore, something we can't do anymore. But it's definitely worth a stop.
Mike, you mentioned the naming, and anybody who knows anything about Rainy Lake knows that there are very few islands that only have one name. I mean, Camp Cooching is Cooch, it's also Grassy Island, Deer Island, and Dalberts is Redcrest, and it's Dalberts, and it's Jackfish, and one name or another gets stuck on the maps. And once they're stuck on the maps, they stay there. The people who own the companies that owned the Bacchus estate on Red Sucker Island didn't like that name very well, and they tried every way they could to get the government to change the name to what they wanted it to be. And they said, you can call it anything you want, but it stays Red Sucker on the map.
And I have that same story, Bert, because when the Hyatt family had Bacchus Island or Curtis Island or Red Sucker Island, whatever you want to call it, she wanted it changed to Windsor Island. And she knew that I had contact with the Coast Guard, and they petitioned me to get a hold of the Coast Guard to see if they could change the name. And I won't use the words that the Coast Guardsman told me about changing the name, but needless to say, it did not happen. It's still Red Sucker Island.
But the one place name that I do know the name, the source of the name, is Frank's Bay, where the lodge was, and that was, we always called it Bancroft Bay growing up. We lost the money. Pardon?
No, we lost the sound for you.
Yep, there you go.
Am I back?
A little more.
But the people who own
A little more on your, closer to your mouth.
I don't think that's good.
It's not.
There you go.
is that better?
That's
No, I think they just cut me off.
It's over.
We'll fix it for you, Vern.
Mike, tell the story about Boone's Island. Even
Well,
though that's not an official name.
Okay, while we're waiting that's not part of my notes, but I know the history of that well. And it's not what you think. But my Grandpa Bob's number one man through years and years and years, especially during the bootleg era, during Prohibition, was Fred Booby Williams from here in Rainier. In fact, he's a past mayor of Rainier. But he was running whiskey up the lake or down the lake. and knowing Fred probably sampling the wares, and ran aground on one of the islands. And the thing is the island he ran aground on is I believe it's the one that Jimbo McCarthy owns, which is Minnetonka Island. But somehow, and I think it was Judy Blaze that did this, is the original Boone's Island, all of a sudden the name was transported over to an island that they always called Sunset Island. But now it officially, and part of the locals, is Boone's Island. Are we fixed yet?
Close.
I'll go on a little bit, and I can't tell any lies on this one, that's for sure, because Vic Davis is here. We're going to talk about Big Vic and Big Louie, and hopefully Vic will...
We have a correction from the back row.
Mhm.
Mike, I think I've been told that the that was the calendar and
Oh, that's what you heard, John?
that's what I've been told by Steve, that's probably a pretty good idea.
Yeah. I use my dad as a source, and that's what I got from Vic. But whatever, it's named after Fred Louie Williams. But I want to talk about briefly Big Vic and Big Louie. They were erected in the early 1980s by Wilderness Properties Incorporated, and when there were three major players, of course, Vic Davis Jr., who was here tonight, Carl Brown, and John Butch McCard. Big Vic was located on Little Cranberry Island, and then Big Louie in the Black Bay Narrows. And I've got a quote here from the Rainy Lake Chronicle, and Vic would have to correct me if I'm wrong on this, but their purpose was to act as a symbol of local resistance to policies that go along with having a national park in one's backyard. Is that fairly accurate? That's pretty close. But eventually the Park Service purchased, the land, and the statues were removed.
Took it.
Took it.
Big difference.
I agree.
That's what the fight was about.
Mhm. And currently Big Vic guards the south entrance here to the business district of Rainier, and Big Louie looks across the highway near Barnum, Minnesota. Are we set for Vern?
Vern, you're back.
Now I forgot what I was doing. No, but the Frank's, when officially Frank's Day was always Bancroft Day. When I was growing up, there was a landing on the mainland, and when Pete Rasculi was running Rainy Lake Lodge, the surveyors came up and they said to him, they were staying at the lodge, and one evening they were having a drink, and somebody said, we don't see a name on the map for this bay. Does it have a name? And Pete Rasculi shouted over to his handyman, Frank, I can't remember his last name. Hey Frank, you want a bay named after you? Frank said, sure, why not? And it became Frank's Bay. But I didn't know what Bancroft was either, so.
Mike,
Yes.
how did they move Vic and Louie?
Well, they were done by helicopters. It's actually photos over here on the display
And they sold
that Ashley's got.
They sold it to Barnum, or?
I'm not sure. We on Big Louie?
Well, first they took Big Vic.
Mm-hmm.
They took my island. And what I wanted to prove was that when the park came in 1975, the big fight was local control versus federal control. Instead of a national park, having a national recreation area, which the rules and regulations were a lot more loose, so people could go on basically like they were. But because of all the politics that was going on, right in the Mondale area, Blatnick, and Dayton's down in Minneapolis organized, and they wanted a park and nothing but a park. So anyway, Big Vic was, politically we knew we never had a chance to change the rules. However, when the park became a park, Merle Brooks was a park superintendent, the Congress had allotted $18 million to buy everybody's land. and a big chunk of the land was owned by Boise, and they haven't sold yet. So I think Boise was gonna sell for like about 1.8 million. And when I say, I gotta be careful. When I say I mean Carl Brown. When I say we, us, or they, I mean Carl and Butch. So anyway, we had to do something out of the box, and the only way we figured we had a chance is through the news media. At that time, back in the late 60s and early 70s, there was basically it was bigger than all of us. The word was like Duluth North with the wolf sanctuary and all the wilderness stuff. Duluth North was actually going to be a playground. And it was pretty close to that. There was, with the wolf, all the wolf sanctuaries, and then the loggers got on board. But anyway, going back to Big Vic, that was an idea that happened in Minneapolis. Pulled into a restaurant and seen a Pillsbury Doughboy outside the door. And I said, wow, that's the idea. Went inside, had supper, asked the waitress where they got that statue built. And she said, I don't know, but the cook does. And the cook was the owner. I mean, this is 40 some years ago. And he told me in Sparta, Wisconsin. I got it built in Sparta. So I stayed overnight. Next day I drove to Sparta. And I find this place. I stopped at a gas station. And I get out in the country and got a building out there. And full of pigs and cows and bulls. And he made a lot of animals. And I said, how much would it cost me to build a statue of a Voyager? And he said, well, how big? And I said, well, it's got to be something. I don't want something like these little cows in that. It's got to be something that you can see. So he said, how about this? 25 feet. It'll weigh about 3,200 pounds. Give him $1,000 down, and he said, Mr. Davis, I am so happy to build something to show my skills in these frickin' animals. So anyway, what they do, it's really interesting. They have these re-rods that go up like that, and then they spray them full of foam. And they got this big block of styrofoam, and then he carves. So he started carving and getting back again, Judy Blaze. She was a local artist, and she worked at the Journal. And so the thing was coming along pretty good. So I said, Judy, would you want to hire Francis Anderson to fly you down to Sparta and check out the project? So she went down there, she gave a few pointers, and she come back and wrote a story, Big Vic. And that's how that name stuck.
Wow.
But anyway, I paid $12,000 for the statue. Another $7,000 to fly it up there by a helicopter. When things happened, they took my island, and they said I could have my statue and my cabin that I built on it. The one thing I wanted to prove to all the people that still own their property, the Park Service, Merle Brooks, says, if you build on your property, I'm going to take it from you. And I said, well, come and get mine first. So anyway, I built the cabin, I put the statue up, put the big sign up, nothing happened, and all of a sudden, boom, eminent domain. They take my island, they give me, I think, $55,000 down. There was kind of a underhanded deal that Carl and Butch put together with Jerry Desson. So you can imagine where that was going. So anyway, they said I could take my statue and my cabin. So I said, okay, that's great. But I had bought another piece of land. So the rumor, they heard I was gonna move it. So So they took it. They took the statue too, and they said if I went up there to get it, I'd be met with armed force. But we were dealing with a bureaucrat, a lawyer in Washington, D.C., that had been there for 42 years. And he was from Texas. And he says, I'm going to show these small town boys what it's all about. Fortunately, a guy by the name of Chad LeDuc came to town. And that old Texan guy with the big hat and the gold stuff and the big necktie met up with a small town lawyer, Chad LeDuc. And so anyway, getting back to the statue, they paid me $5,500 for the statue, and I had paid $12 grand. I said, you know, what's that all about? Here's the bill. So anyway, I said, okay, that's what really pissed me off. So then I went and bought Big Louie for $16,000. So then they knew they were dealing with a different kind of people up here. So now the Park Service got a $5,500 statue that they don't want. Ed Woods happened to be the mayor at that time. And he said, maybe we could get that statue in the Rainier. And so between me and Ed and the Park Service, I'm not gonna sue you for more money, or if it's going to Rainier, that's fine. So the Park Service couldn't give it, so they sold it to the Village of Rainier for $1. And then Edmund Woods, Sammy, owned the property out there. They donated that little chunk of land to the Village of Rainier, and then they put the statue there. So, that's basically there's lots of other stuff other than singing where the eyes and the ushers don't include me. But anyway, that's kind of the history of how Big Vic got there. Yeah.
Thanks, Vic.
Yeah.
What's that? Yes, why don't you go, Ashley?
Okay, so I'm sure everyone is very familiar with the Mermaid or the Lady of the Lake, but a lot of people are very unfamiliar with her story. There's a lot of legends out there as to how she got there or why she's there, but not a lot of people know the real story behind the Mermaid. A couple of the stories that have been circulating are that the Mermaid has been constructed to memorialize a victim of drowning. There's two different versions of that story. One is that there was a girl who was swimming and she was trying to reach the rock where the mermaid is, and she didn't make it and she drowned. And then the other story is that there was a girl who had simply drowned in Rainy Lake. In both of those drowning versions, the father of the girl was overcome with grief and commissioned this statue of the mermaid to be commissioned in her memory. The other story is that there was a real siren in Rainy Lake, and she had come out onto the rock to sun herself, and she fell in love with the view, and she didn't want to climb down off of the rock again, because she just loved looking at the nature so much, and so she ended up turning into stone. Obviously, that is not true. And of course, the drowning stories are both very possible, but those are not true either. The real story of the mermaid is that there was an interview done with the gentleman who created her back in 1990, and she was created by a man named Gordon Schlichting in 1934. Gordon was an architectural student, and he was up here. He'd been to Rainy Lake several times, and he was working on Dr. Lisney's island. And while he was up there working and doing construction, they had a lot of extra materials laying around, and in the evenings he had some free time. So he thought he would make monument. And his family or some relatives, someone that he knew had a boat that was named the Mermaid, and he thought a mermaid would be very fitting for Rainy Lake. So he went to an outcropping of rocks near Copenhagen Island, and he decided that he was going to build this statue. And the mermaid is very large. If you have seen her and been up close to her, she's 1.5 times the size of like a normal person. And she's very Romanesque in style. Like she's big, and busty. And there's some disagreement as to the inspiration for the mermaid. Some people claimed that they modeled for the mermaid. Now, if you've looked at her, there's no woman that modeled for that mermaid. And Gordon stated in his interview that at the time he was very unfamiliar with the female figure, and it was very evident if you look at the mermaid, like you would be able to tell that, because he wasn't married at the time. So he was just like making the mermaid from like memory of like whatever he thinks a woman would probably look like, if you know what I mean.
You're not concerned about the lower half.
Yeah, he didn't have to worry about it because I mean it's just a tail. But she's very hippie, you know. So anyway, so he's working on the island. He has these extra materials, and what he did is he built a form. So he built this form out of like wood and like rebar and stuff. And so he like hauls out all of this stuff to the rock, and he drills like footings into the rock to place her. He puts the form on, and he starts like just pouring all of this cement into this thing. And after the concrete hardens, he spends 2 months chiseling this mermaid. And there were like 3 separate occasions that he thinks that he's gonna just give up. And thank God he didn't, because could you imagine what that would look like? Like if you just stopped halfway, there'd just be like this weird blob with like breasts. maybe only her face. I don't know which end he started at, but I'm imagining it's like from the top down. So good for us that he did. And he really did a good job, because when he finished and he left Rainy Lake and kind of just forgot about the mermaid, he did come back for his honeymoon. And when he came back on his honeymoon, he realized that the gator boats, for what they used during logging, like pulling the log booms, they were using the mermaid as an anchor. So they're just like hooking these giant chains around her and like winching and like using her as a point of security. And so he was like, wow, I did a really bang up job on this, because these giant boats are pulling on her and she's not coming off at all. But he thought that maybe over time, like all of this pressure, she would fall off the rock. And her neighbors weren't very happy about her being there, because she started to become a tourist attraction and there was a lot of increased traffic. So some of his friends offered to, blow her up. They were like, hey, we have like some extra explosives. We'll just go out there. We can get rid of her real quick. But he declined. And when he came back in 1990, it was he kind of figured it would be his last visit to Rainy Lake and the last time he would ever see his mermaid, because his health was declining. And he was really glad to see her still sitting out on her rock on Rainy Lake. He was glad that, the gators hadn't destroyed her, he didn't let his friends blow her up, that no one else had blown her up, that, she was still kind of just hanging out. And so anyway, so if you see her, if you go and visit her, you say hi to Gordon, too, because I'm sure maybe he's hanging out, maybe he came to visit her, but he did a really good job. I'm impressed by that. I would be out there. And that's the story of the Lady of the Lake.
And as a neighbor growing up with the mermaid, I can't remember ever being as cold in my life as walking by the mermaid after there'd been a strong wind and the lake had blown up onto her and her icicles hanging off of it. Oh, it was terrible. But my addition to the mermaid story is my father operated the houseboat for the paper company and it was in Swell Bay, which had just passed the Mermaid on the Canadian side. And it's north of Sandpoint Island. You probably all know the map as well as I do. But Sandpoint Island, the largest island on the lake, with a sandbar connecting to another good-sized island. Well, the houseboat was north of Sandpoint and east of the island, the attached island, and there was that sandbar was called Goose Portage. And people would sometimes think that it was just a sandbar that you could cut a little bit of travel off by pulling your canoes across it. My father, who was the notorious practical joker, would be fishing with his 3 boats, 18-foot aluminum boats, fishing from the houseboat up in the Swell Bay. And he'd say, fishing's a little slow, why don't we go over into Goose Lake and try that? And everybody was fine with that, so he'd run the 3 boats over to the sandbar, pull these heavy boats across. All the guests, my father actually has a few pictures, but most of the time he used an empty camera, so he didn't get involved in that nonsense. But they would pull these 3 boats with all their gear across the portage and fish for a while, and then head back to the houseboat without going across the portage, which was always a bit startling when people would portage into this other lake, which they recognized as being a prettier lake, the Rainy Lake even. And anyway, the one time he had 2 young fellows with him, and when they came around, they had swum by the Mermaid, which they had seen on the way going up. So he stopped the boat, they looked around, they saw this mermaid, and they said, "Hey, there's the mermaid." Dad says, "Yeah, there's one of those damn things in all these lakes around here." He figured if they knew how to get back to the boat, he would have been in the drink.
You know, one of my favorite stories about the Mermaid is a group of men on a houseboat. I think it was like a Memorial Weekend a few years back, but they drove by the Mermaid, and one of them decided he wanted to pose in the nude with the Mermaid. So they idled up to the little rocky island, and he got his clothes off, and he's, with the Mermaid. They just drove off and left him. I don't know how long he was there, but there was a lot of boat traffic because it wasn't nice day. So every time a boat would approach, he would submerge himself, just with his head sticking out. So anyway, if you're going by the Mermaid and you want to have your photo taken with it, be careful who you're with. But I do have another story about an island in Rainy Lake. The name of this is not politically correct, but Jap Island. Is anybody familiar with Jap Island?
Oh, yeah.
Not a few people are, of course. It's located east of the Brule, just a little bit north of the Constantine cabin on Kauai Island. But it's named after Zen Fujita, who was Japanese American. He was born in 1888 in Hiroshima, Japan, and he emigrated to the United States as a teenager. Ended up in Chicago in 1915. He was a news photographer. Eventually moved into commercial and artistic photography, and also was a poet. It's reputed that he actually took the photos of the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. But anyway, he wanted to buy a retreat up in the north, in Rainy Lake, but he was unable to because Minnesota law at that time prohibited ownership of land by Asian aliens. But he had a friend who he eventually married, Florence Carr, and she actually purchased the property. He used the cabin until 1941 when World War II broke out, and then he kind of was stuck in Chicago throughout the war, and he used the cabin after, and he ended up dying in 1963. It should be noted that he was one of the few Japanese Americans during the World War II era that was not, kept in an internment camp. But if you stop at the island, there's a nice little dock, There's a path leading up to the house, the cabin, which is still intact. There's an open air outdoor buffet if you're not bashful, but it is a great spot to have a picnic. Oh, and I do, if anybody's interested, I've got, your computer, you get everything, but I've got a story of the island in great detail, if anybody wants this after. Ready?
Yeah, I think, speaking of artistic places, when we were at Dahlberg's, there was a building that was totally useless. We called it the Teepee. And for many years, the Teepee at Dahlberg's at Redcrest stood as a landmark for much of western Rainy Lake. It stood on a high cliff overlooking the water, was covered in birch bark, was about 25 feet high, and had a stairway up the back side and a lookout platform around the top. The interior had a circular fireplace in the center, an upright piano against the back wall, and 8 Chinese red cushions filled with live silk on the around the outside. And if I can turn the page that way. The screened-in porch overlooking the lake had wicker furniture and a telephone connected to the main house phone system. The main purpose of the telephone was to annoy the butler by calling down to the main house and ordering drinks which he had to carry up the hill. In 1926, Sinclair Lewis was working on his novel Elmer Gantry and was invited by Mary Dahlberg, Rohr's first wife, to enjoy the peace and quiet of Redcrest where he could work. Lewis had indicated that he wanted a circular room to work in, and I'm not sure if it was a teepee was built to serve that desire, or if it was already there and just filled the bill. But certainly the story is that he did his writing in the teepee. He also was apparently a drinker of some more than modest capacity, and at times his host and guests were startled to hear the drunken author say, "I'm going to burn the bitch." Although there was suspicion that he was referring to Mary Dahlberg, the reality was that it was Sharon Falconer, one of the lead protagonists in the novel, who grinned in the book. In doing research for this talk, I found that in Wikipedia, quote, Lewis finished the book while mending a broken leg on Jackfish Island in Rainy Lake, Minnesota. The character of Sharon Falconer was based loosely on events in the career of Canadian-born actress or author, evangelical Amy Semple McPherson. That's in Wikipedia. The teepee did not suffer the vandalism that the rest of the state did, as the ownership of the teepee was passed on to Ernest Oberholzer, who had a crew of First Nations workers disassemble the building, lowered it down the hill to the lake, moved it over to the Review Islands, and reassembled it where today it is today. No more birch bark, no more telephone, no more piano, no more silk. But it is a survivor.
Thanks, Barry. A little earlier I mentioned Rainy Lake City. I know most of you know where it is. Where it was just across Black Bay Narrows from Shea Shea Resort. It was incorporated on the 17th of May, 1894, and that was a year after gold was discovered on Little American Island. At that time of incorporation, it boasted 3 general stores, a post office, a customs office, and 5 saloons. But it grew from there quickly, adding a newspaper, a bank, many more saloons, residences, and quite a few disreputable people. And its population at its peak, they say, was 500. But by 1901, the gold rush had fizzled out and the city was largely abandoned. Buildings were either moved to the new little community of Cochiching, which is now International Falls, or they were dismantled and the lumber was used for new construction. Today there are no original buildings left on the site. The one that's there was built after, but wagon ruts can still be seen on where the city streets used to be. It is an interesting stop. I'll go on. Okay, this one I call Long Gone Rainy Lake Resorts. You see it over here on Ashley and Corey's gallery that there's pictures there of the Rainy Lake Boosters Club and also the Chamber of Commerce. But there's 25 of them listed right here that I have. Of course, the location of that building is 2nd Avenue and Highway 11. But I have questions for the audience. Anchorage Resort. Anybody remember Anchorage? You get a few. Jackfish Bay. But the next one, Borderview. Where was Borderview? Crystal Beach. That's probably right where almost Lindy's is. But you remember Borderview? No. Rainy Lake Lodge. We all remember Pete,
yes.
Pete and Ella.
Pete and Ella.
Yeah. For Pete's sake and the love of Allah,
Yep.
remember the sign? How about Sandy Shore Cabins? I have no idea where that was. Point of Pines, I know where Point of Pines is, but obviously there was a resort there once. Rainbow Resort. King's Cabins, I think those were by Birch Point. Island View Lodge, of course we all know what Island View Lodge. How about Anderson's Ganachwan? I've heard Vernon talk about that. But that's Holiday Isle now? Okay. And Birch Point, obviously on Birch Point. Bellhaven, everybody remember Bellhaven, where that was? Now known as the Thunderbirds. Four Islands.
I have a question. Was it Bellhaven? Was there another name before it became Thunderbird?
Yes. When it was first built, 1937, it was called Scotty's Place. Scotty the Lad. And when the Bannon family, Leon Bannon family, purchased it in 1947, they named it Bellhaven. And my parents thought that because the Bannons were Jewish, that Bellhaven maybe had something to do with the Jewish culture. But in looking through the abstract, when we bought the place, was a sawmill there at one time. It was owned by John Haven, and his wife was named Bell. So it's obvious that that's how they got it. But Tom Shannon from Duluth bought it in the mid to late 60s and called it Anglers Resort. I heard to answer your question. Anglers. But then Bud Hagerman bought it in 71 and named it the Thunderbird, and it's been named Thunderbird ever since.
The Bellhaven was a good place to stay out of because you had a hard time leaving once you got in.
I suppose. But Four Islands, of course, that's where the Rainy Lake Visitor Center is located. But then there's some others that are not on the list over here. Morrison Point. I remember Morrison Point. And
Heard of it.
in X Bay, it says it's another mapmaker's mistake. It says Elks Bay. It's supposed to be X Bay. How about Carroll's Beach? Like I remember riding my bike by that when we were heading up to my grandpa's farm. Now Oster's Motel, that's Rainier, if I remember right. Lakeview Cabins, that's Finstead, Joanne. Camp Idlewood, I remember Roger Seaver Day. How about Cozy Cove Camp? Absakan Island. A lot of history there. Bald Rock Camp. Then we've got Northern Air Floating Lodges. Of course, they're still there under new ownership. Bowman Airways, they're on the list. I missed that place. And then, now I mentioned Holiday Island, but Vern gave us the previous history. But of all those places, only half a dozen are still in existence.
How about that
John
Sunken
Erickson's
Island?
resort.
Right across from,
Pardon me?
How about John Erickson's resort?
No, that,
John Erickson's marina,
mm,
right there.
yeah, well, there's a lot of old stuff, but I'm using
Yeah.
the sign in here as a reference.
That was my first job with John Erickson. I was in 7th grade. He had a whole bunch of wooden rowboats
Mhm.
and terrors there underneath the thing. And I'd go and bail them old wooden boats out with a small can. And then when the guys got off the work at the mill, they'd come out there, row to the boom logs. In an hour, they'd catch their 6 fish and come back before dark.
And you'd have to clean them.
Yeah, but not me.
Well, I can keep going here, but.
how about that Sunken Island?
Pardon me?
That's Sunken.
Yeah, that's okay, I've got that
Was
mentioned.
that Hardy Island or?
No, that's east.
Next,
That's,
right close to the.
Whatever happened, what is it, just private now?
yes, yeah, it's the Hanson family.
It is now split into two ownerships. I'm not sure what
Did you have more?
Who married Duncan Rosser?
You
We're gonna
didn't
move on.
mention Norway Island.
That was not on the list.
How come?
You weren't members of the chamber.
That's for another day.
From here.
Okay, I'm gonna talk just briefly about the car and the little blue and arrows. Everybody familiar with the car and the blue and arrows? I've always wondered about it. But you know, there's actually 3 blue and arrows. There's the regular blue and arrows that we use in the Bowie Channel. There's the little blue, which is just north, full of rocks. North of that's the canoe channel. But an old friend of mine, Frank Johnson, I asked Frank if he knew the history of the car, and he said to give Manny Herzig a call, which I did. And Manny told me that he bought that car, a used Studebaker, in 1960. He used it as a family car, but then bought a larger car when his family grew. He cut the back off the old Studebaker and used it as a pickup. Then he bought a regular pickup, so the Studebaker then remained unused. But then Stanley Johnson bought it for $10. And the purpose was to drive it up to John Kulikowski's fish camp over the ice, later on in the spring, probably March, to be used for their annual ice harvest. Well, the engine blew. Well, they couldn't go through the Lost Bay Portage, the snow was too deep, but bypassing it, going through the little Brule, the engine blew, and so the guys winched it up on shore and put it on blocks, and it's been there ever since. Cannibalized, but it's still there, sitting on shore.
That's over by, what's else his name? He has a big cabin.
Yeah, I think it's one cabin pretty close. But then Herbie Williams, you know, our family, close family friend told me this story happened to him during the bootleg era. He, yeah, would be done here really quick. I'll call on you. But Herb told me this story as a young man. It was wintertime, and he and one of his buddies were operating a still somewhere on Rainy Lake, and a vehicle drove up, and Herbie and his buddy were both arrested for, you know, manufacture of alcohol. And Herb refused to be handcuffed. His buddy, unfortunately, allowed himself to be handcuffed, and the vehicle then proceeded down the lake, broke through the ice, went to the bottom. Herb and the 2 revenue agents survived, but the young man that was handcuffed is still in that vehicle somewhere in the bottom of Rainy Lake. Now, Herbie died in 1965, and I wish I would have got the exact location out of him, but I think of it all the time when I got your exotic fish finder on and you see a little blur. I wonder if that could be. But somewhere out there's that car or truck with a body in it. Are we close to being done?
We could go on for a lot longer. We could promise to go.
Yeah. But I do have one more. I promise this is the last one. Soldiers Point. Anybody familiar where Soldiers Point is on Rainy? It's on the far east end, U.S. side of the Brule Narrows. But my question here is how did Soldiers Point get its name, and what does it have to do with the father of Manitoba? I often wondered, when I was looking at maps when I was a kid, where there was Soldiers Point and then there was Soldiers Portage at Kettle Falls, that my dad told me that a Canadian Army once moved through this whole area, and that's how these two places got their name. Then years ago, I saw a documentary on Canadian television by Pierre Burton that talked about the Red River Rebellion that was instigated by a man by the name of Louie Riel. Riel was a Métis, a half-breed, and he was upset. He and the Métis were upset with Canada, Ottawa in particular, for their discriminatory practices against the natives. So he wanted to take that Manitoba territory and make it a separate part, a different nation actually in Canada. But in 1870, a Canadian army, commanded by Colonel Garnet Wolseley, sailed from East Canada, 1,000 of them, landed at Port Arthur, which is now Thunder Bay, and began that long trek through what's now called the Superior Quetico, right through here, on their way to Fort Garry, which is now called Winnipeg. They put down the rebellion without firing a shot. Louis Riel took off to the United States, where he stayed for quite a few years, but he still was upset with Canada, and he returned to Manitoba. But in 1885, he was arrested, for treason and hanged. But his actions in Manitoba precipitated the entry of Manitoba into the Dominion of Canada, and so now there's a lot of people in Manitoba call him the father of Manitoba.
On the TV, on ABC, they had How the West Was Won. There's a story on
Yeah.
the storyboard, and he was hanged.
Mm-hmm. If you go on the internet, there's some really interesting stories about him. But sir?
I read a story in your book about people going from Las Vegas to Chicago without going through the road.
Yes.
Dave, I have a mic for you over here.
Oh, you drove through the Las Vegas portage? I was going to do that. We're talking about the 2014. There's two things I was going to do. I was going to go through the Las Vegas portage with my boat. I also was going to tie up at the front steps of the hotel. You did make it through.
We made it.
You and Paul.
2014. We went from Las Vegas
to Saginaw
without going through the road.
Yes.
On the snowmobile track.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. I was hoping somebody would have done that.
Well, nobody's done it since 1950.
Right. Yes. And hopefully we don't flood again.
Hopefully.
But do you have any questions for the three of us? No, we have one, two. We got Don Fuller and we got Wayne.
Hey, Dave, I stole your shirt.
Hey Mike, I thought one of the more interesting professions on the lake was the dam tender at Kettle Falls. I thought maybe you might know something about it, I'm not sure.
Well, you've got
I
actually
heard he was quite a legend himself, but I don't know who it was.
What, you're talking about the dam tenders in general?
Yes.
Well, you got two of them here. You got my brother Chuck and myself.
Let's talk about it.
Anyway,
What did you do?
Because you could.
well, our duties as dam tenders were to operate the stop log operation. And that's opening the dam or closing it, and that's 12 months a year. Fairly nice, easy job in the summer. Extremely difficult in the winter. But through the years, I give you the history of the dam tenders. The dam was completed in 1914. Both dams were at Kettle Falls. And a guy by the name of Chris Munson then actually was the dam tender until the late 1940s. Then there were a few individuals, including Lauren Erickson from Rainier, that operated until 1950 when Herb Williams took over. He died of a heart attack up there in '65, and my dad took over. And then Chuck and I, of course, were there working daily with him on that. And then I took over in '73, and then Chuck did in '83. And Chuck was there just until just a few years ago.
I heard he did a lot better job than you did.
Well, one good point about it.
He's here.
One good point about it is we're still upright. That was an extremely dangerous job. It's a miracle that nobody ever was hurt or worse. But now Tyson Whitbeck and a Skyme are actually the dam tenders. And I'm not sure if they're employees or they're contractors or what the deal is. But it remains an extremely difficult, dangerous job.
Describe that job.
Oh, the
What
job?
made it so difficult, dangerous?
Well, the stomp log operation, the logs are 12 inches by 12 inches, it's 16 feet long, and they go down a narrow channel or up the narrow channel, one at a time. And all these open gears. I mean, the Boise, and M&O, and then Boise safety director, Don Eisnick was his name, had orders from the company never ever to go at the dam and even look at it. Because it was in such violation, if he ever went to court, he could honestly say that he'd never been there. But it's just a simple fact that, but in the winter, we'd have to shimmy on down and beat these logs with the sledgehammer and put a torch on them to break them loose one at a time. And some of our bosses, you know, they're always from the powerhouse at Fort Francis, were really, really good and tried to set things up early in the winter so they would stay the same all winter. But then there were others that followed that micromanaged, especially when Chuck had the job, having them up there daily, weekly, you know. But anyway, and I see this TV show, Most Dangerous Jobs. I've never seen one as dangerous as that. Now, Don had a question back here.
What about the tower at Dunsmore Island?
That, you know, that'd be a burn question. The tower at Dunsmore.
Dunsmore Island. Dr. Dunsmore and the big like windmill there.
It wasn't a windmill. It was just a tower. I think there was a windmill at French's, and at Roberts, hooked up some power. But the tower at Dunsmore's are Sheldrips. Sheldrip was his son-in-law, as I recall it, and had it for a long time. But that was, I don't know the purpose of that. It may be like many other buildings on the lake, it had no purpose. Found use without a purpose.
Any more questions?
Yes, one more.
Oh, pardon me?
You talk about Tony the Pony?
I can't hear what
Tony wants to know about the horse.
Oh, that's Ashley. Ashley knows about the horse.
Yeah. So Tony, I'm not really sure if he's a pony or a horse because he's very small. If you look at him in the photographs, the cutoff size for a pony is 14.2 hands, which a hand is 4 inches when you're measuring. Anything over 14.2 is considered a horse. I have horses. My horses are pretty small because I'm not very tall, so I don't want to climb up there. Anyways, so Tony was originally brought to Rainy Lake by Bob and Maud Calder in 1968, and his original purpose was to haul ice to help during the ice harvest. Now, I'm not really sure. I think he might be older than what he was estimated because in 1968, like, he would have literally just been born, which he would have been useless in 1968, like just as like walking around a little baby foal. So he would have had to have been at least 2 years old. So when the Calders died in 1986. There was still family that went up to the island, and he was actually on Birch Island, which is about 20 miles up into Canada, on the northern Canadian side. And so his family, his relatives, were still coming to take care of him, and then they just sort of stopped. And so the neighbors tried to corral this horse, and he was like, nope, I'm gonna be free, I'm gonna be feral. And so he started living on various islands. There were about 3 islands that he rotated around. And the reason why he rotated basically between 3. So he would go and he would graze on this island, and then in the winter he would kind of like move off and go to a different island. And he did that because it would take about 3 years for the vegetation to grow back up after he grazed it down. And there were some people that he particularly liked, a couple by the name of Donna and Calvin Lee. They helped take care of him because they lived up there full time. And so he would go and visit them basically every third year. He would end up on their island. Also, Wade and Carol Pavlik, they have a cabin up in that area of Rainy Lake, and so they would bring him hay and oats and help get him through the winter. A lot of people wonder, like, how did this horse survive without getting eaten by wolves? So basically, Tony was smart enough when he was at Donna and Calvin's that he would kind of back himself into their house, like into a corner, so that way his back end was protected and he could kind of defend himself from the front end if he had to. I don't know what he did on like the other two islands, wherever he was in the winter, but he managed. In January of 2000, Tony was featured. He was on the front page of the Daily Journal. That's where those two pictures are from. And he was also aired on St. Paul News broadcast in WDIO Duluth. He was also on a feature called On the Road. At that time, he was roughly 32 years old. I would guess he was probably more like 34. Because like I said, he would have to be at least 2 years old in 1968 to be like usable to help with any work. He had been living on his own at that time for over a decade. I mean, with the help of his friends. The next year in 2001, Tony had passed away. Wade had not seen him in a while, so Wade went looking for him, and he found Tony. He had discovered his body on an island, kind of like in a low area, like a little marsh, like bog. So Wade was not sure if he maybe like fell through, like in a thaw, because horses are very heavy, so they cannot lay down for a long period of time. What happens is they'll crush themselves to death, basically. So they're not sure if he fell through, or maybe he just had a heart attack and he had just passed away there, like when it was frozen, or what happened. But anyway, that's the story of Tony. And so there was a little feral horse running around Rainy Lake for a decade.
What all went on Gulber's Island? You had that big, huge house up there, the big white round piano.
Well, I imagine a lot of parties.
I heard
The Johnson family were caretakers here for quite a while.
Richard Tyson told me that when they come up here from Hollywood, big party. They had a big two engine I/O for inboard. They go up there, you could hear the house would rattle when they went up, making a big wave. Right over it was a week-long party.
Well, thank you for coming, everybody. Hey, Mike. We couldn't do this without you.
One more story.
Hey, Vic. Vic has got one more story.
One more story about how colorful Rainier language is. I'm going to go back to the Big Vic statue. I arranged to have the statue at the Thunderbird Lodge. Were you there then in 1979?
No, I wasn't.
Okay. So the statue's on a trailer at the Thunderbird Lodge, and I arranged for a helicopter coming out of Dryden, Ontario. They were up there fighting forest fires, and I called them up, and they had a break. And I said, "Can you do a job for me?" And they said, "What is it?" So I told them, "You got to hook onto this 3,200-pound, 25-foot statue and haul it up Rainy Lake to Little Cranberry Island." So they agreed to do it. We agreed on the cost, and I said, "I'll meet you at the Fort Francis Airport, 11 o'clock. So I met him out there in a big Huey helicopter, and it's 4 young guys, about 30 years old, and they were pretty excited. So I filled up their fuel, and before I left the Fort Francis Airport to go up to the T-Bird to help with the statue, I told them, make sure you clear U.S. Customs at the International Falls Airport. So I hop in my car. I'm on my way through U.S. Customs, and the port director at that time was a Rainier family by the name of Ovison, Dwayne Ovison. And Dwayne, he was the port director, so I come across, they pull me in. Pulled around, I go inside, and Mr. Ovison comes out and says, "Get back here." He pulls me in his office and he said, "Sit the F down." And my heart's beating through my chest. And he pulls out his drawer and he pulls out a folder about that thick. And it's got my name on it. And he said, "What the F is going on?" And I said, "You read the paper." And he opened up that folder and I said, "Hey, Mr. Ovison." He was a friend of the family's back in the days. And I says, "By the look of that folder, you know more about me than I do. I want a lawyer." He says, "Get the F out of here." So I go outside and I hop in my truck and I hear a boom, 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 boom. There's a big Huey helicopter. Not going to the Falls Airport, going down the river to the T-Bird. So anyway, by the time I get to the T-Bird, they had the statue already hooked up and it's going down the lake. I hopped in somebody's boat. I said, "You got to get me up there as quick as you can because we got trouble." I get up there and the statue is already on the template, on the Paul Swenson, Butch Lassard, all the old Rainier boys helped build it. We got a houseboat up there, and the helicopter, the water was low that May, and the helicopter was sitting on the shoreline of the island. The pilot and his 3 crew are on the houseboat eating hamburgers. I get there and I said, "You better get that baby out of here because there'll be a chain around it in less than 10 minutes. Then boys jumped off that boat, ran down that shore, and that thing took off and went, like you say, right across the Sandpoint Island. They were gone. But to make a long story short, it was the name of the company was Okanagan Helicopters, and they ran helicopters all over the world. So the U.S. government fined them $700,000. But they got it mitigated down. Thank God Senator Bob Lassard had a brother that kind of was a ombudsman's brother or whatever from this area, and they got the thing mitigated down. But anyway, that was another little thing that happened.
Little bump in the road.
Little bump in the road with Rainier boys.
Yeah. Cheer for Vic.
Well, thank you, everybody.